After a voyage of 22 days, Crusoe lands in Brazil, accepting many farewell gifts from the Portuguese captain. After meeting his Anglo-Brazilian neighbor, he conceives a plan to become a tobacco planter. For 2 years Crusoe earns only enough on which to subsist, but in the 3rd year he begins to do well and, in retrospect, misses the labor potential of the slave boy Crusoe, whom he sold. Having told the Portuguese captain of his £200 left in England, the captain arranges to have £100 sent to Crusoe in Brazil, along with many gifts besides. After receiving what the captain sent, Crusoe feels quite well off. Eager for slave labor to extend his business further, he agrees to an acquaintance's plan to sail to Guinea for black slaves, in exchange for his own share of the slaves. After writing a will leaving half his possessions to the Portuguese captain, Crusoe sets sail for Guinea on September 1, 1659 with a cargo of trinkets with which to buy slaves. Sailing up the South American coast, the ship encounters a storm, and 2 men are lost. Crusoe fears for his life. Reaching the Caribbean, the ship is shaken by yet another storm that drives the ship onto the sand, breaking the rudder. The ship is clearly doomed, and the crew climbs into boats to make for shore. Crusoe loses sight of his mates when all are swept away by an immense wave. Finally Crusoe makes it to shore, where he immediately prays to God in gratitude. He never sees a sign of another living crew member. After drinking some fresh water and finding a tree in which to sleep, Crusoe spends his first night on the island. Awakening the next morning refreshed, Crusoe goes down to the shore to explore the remains of the ship. Swimming around it, he finds it impossible to climb aboard until he finds a chain hanging, by which he pulls himself up. Crusoe conceives the idea of building a raft out of broken lumber, on which he loads provisions of bread, rice, goat meat, cheese, and other foods. He also finds clothes, arms, and fresh water. He sails his cargo-laden raft into a small cove, where he unloads it. He notices that the land has wildfowl but no other humans. Crusoe returns to the ship 12 times over the following 13 days. On one of the later trips he finds £36, and he sadly meditates on how worthless the money is to him. After a strong wind that night, he awakens to find the ship's remains gone the next morning. Wary of savages, Crusoe decides he must build a dwelling or fortress, as he calls it. He chooses a spot with a view of the sea, protected from animals and the heat of the sun and near fresh water. He drives wooden stakes into the ground, using them as a frame for walls. Crusoe sleeps securely in the shelter that night. The next day he hauls all of his provisions and supplies inside, and hangs a hammock on which to sleep. He also builds a cellar. During a thunderstorm he suddenly worries about his gunpowder supply, which he separates from the other supplies and stores in the cellar. Crusoe discovers wild goats on the island. He kills one and then sees that it had a kid, which he then kills too. On about his 12th day on the island, he erects a large cross that he inscribes with the date of his arrival, September 30, 1659. He resolves to cut a notch on the cross to mark every passing day. He also begins a journal in which he records the good and evil aspects of his experience, until he runs out of ink. He keeps watch for passing ships, always disappointed. The question of whether Crusoe's humanity will survive on the island, or whether he will revert to savagery, is subtly raised in these chapters. His changing relationship to Crusoe is one example of a test of morality. During his early acquaintance with the boy, Crusoe appears genuinely fond of him, moved by the boy's expression of loyalty and by their solidarity as slaves of the same master. But then, Crusoe, recently a slave himself, coldly sells Crusoe to the Portuguese captain with no compunction at all. When Crusoe thinks about Crusoe later, he does not recollect memories of a long-lost acquaintance, but instead laments missing out on the potential for slave labor. He and his planter neighbor both wanted help, and now I found, more than before, I had done wrong in parting with my boy Crusoe. We might feel what is wrong is not his business decision, but the sale of his supposed friend as a slave for profit. The question of whether morality is socially adaptable or naturally inborn was disputed in 17th-century England, The philosopher Thomas Hobbes has maintained that men are naturally savages. Crusoe is a case study in the nature of human morals. Crusoe's sense of religion seems, on the one hand, to develop strongly, but on the other hand, some of his words do raise some doubt about his beliefs. Certainly he appears very devout when his first reaction on reaching dry land after his shipwreck is to look up and thank God that my life was saved in a case wherein there was some minutes before scarce any room to hope. But, as many have noticed, his comments right after this remark are theologically unsound. I believe it is impossible to express to the life what the ecstasies and transports of the soul are when it is so saved, as I may say, out of the very grave. As any devout Christian of Defoe's day would know, the soul is eternal, and what Crusoe should instead say is that his bodily life is saved. The remark is thus a bit ignorant even at the moment when he appears to be deeply God-fearing. Later, when he builds a cross on the island and devotes it to himself and his time on the island, rather than to Christ, our doubt over his true faith in God grows further.